It does say recording on
Okay,
mice.
great, great. So essentially, when you take a substance and you prepare it into a homeopathic medicine, you are taking the root vibration of that original substance. And this is absolutely one of the original points of divergence between naturopathic medicine, holistic medicine, what used to be called more vitalist approaches from the rationalist approaches. And then as we got more and more into the molecular world, that was shunned and poo-pooed and thought, this isn't anything because there's no molecules in the medicine. Well, now that we're in the realm and the age of physics, we have to revisit this because really everything in the entire universe is made out of a vibration at the smallest level. So this is really where the science around water has absolutely taken off. And I would encourage all of you to look on YouTube for a annual water conference that happens in, I believe it's Bulgaria, but just some of the most fascinating information that I can think of is what is known about water. And if anybody's seen Frozen 2, Olaf likes to talk about how water has memory and water has the capacity for memory. And I just love that about that movie when I took my 6-year-old daughter, to see it, because it really does have memory in that you can have water that has structure to it. And that capacity of water to hold the memory of something that has passed through it is really the foundation from a quantum physics level of how homeopathy works. But lest I digress, so nature cure is the other half of where the term naturopathic medicine comes from. And nature cure is the method of using water in temperature, meaning applications of water on usually the external part of a person. And it actually originated in 19th century Austria and Germany with some different lay practitioners that had discovered that they could stimulate the immunity of their cattle or their sheep by spraying them with cold water. And then it kind of morphed into treatments of patients by doing things where they would wrap the patient in a cold, wet sheet for 30 minutes and essentially stimulate a fever that would then be shown to be curative of a multitude of different issues going on. So these were the origins of these vitalistic approaches. That is what our medicine is taken from. And I really like to really point out this difference in the terms, because nearly every single patient that I've ever seen comes in and they say, well, I don't like, the traditional medicine, blah, 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 blah. And I say, hold up. Because traditional is really us. We're the folks that have been around for thousands of years and doing all the holistic medicine and taking things from the earth and implementing these approaches, whereas the conventional approach is really the convention of now, and this more rational, what we call reductionist and research-based approach. So I really like to point out to people the difference between those two. So how do we differ from conventional medicine? So for one, I really like to point out to patients that we really focus on the root cause of all diseases. We're going to go and figure out why is this particular issue happening and address those fundamental drivers, whether it be, your microbiome is disturbed, maybe it's chronic inflammation, perhaps it is toxicity. That's a big one in this day and age. And then certainly we have all kinds of emotional drivers and family history. What maybe a lot of us have heard the term epigenetics. So that's kind of a fancy scientific way of talking about family history. And then the second area that I would say we really diverge again from the conventional medical approach is how we interface with acute illness. So we work to avoid this concept of suppression at all costs. So what does that mean, suppression? It means when you have a rash, which, nearly every patient is not going to tolerate very well, we are going to suggest that we try to identify what is the root cause of the rash. Why do you have a rash? What's driving this rash? Is it an overload of your liver and kidney? Does it have to do with a chronic yeast, weak digestion? Have you taken something that has toxified your system? And we don't really very often just assume that it's something in our laundry detergent when somebody has a rash. There's just one simple way of looking at that, but we're much more often to look at, well, what's interfaced with the surface that is in your interior, meaning when you eat something, it goes through the gastrointestinal tract, but it's not really inside of you until it's been broken down and then absorbed through the intestinal wall. So that interior is really analogous to the skin on the exterior. It's like your inner skin. And the same with the mucosa. So when people have asthma and allergies in the springtime, we're thinking about what's going on in the gastrointestinal tract based on what you're eating that would be driving chronic inflammation that would then cause the rest of the mucosa in the body to be inflamed and thus porous. Porous meaning, we should have a very tight boundary in our gut that's well defended and well protected by bacteria and mucus and all kinds of immunological goodies. But this gets disrupted very easily. And now we're living in a world where we're systematically dumping glyphosate, which is Roundup, weed killer, on our food, which makes absolutely no sense. And I'm sure we've all heard about the lawsuits against Monsanto and now Bayer with people who suffer from leukemia and the lymphomas and the different blood cancers. But these absolutely are cancers that have a very strong relationship to toxicants. So that's, absolutely another area that we differ from conventional medicine. It was hard to keep this list short because we actually dive into what are the potential exposures that a person could have had. Where have you lived all throughout your life? What chemicals do you keep under your kitchen sink? Are you eating organic food? And we really just don't stick our head in the sand about this, the fact that if the earth is a toxic place, then we are also toxic because we are part of the earth. So next, I would say that we differ because we really go deep into history. And in my 20 plus years of practicing, I've really noticed the degradation of the art of taking a very good clinical history. We really dive deep into understanding what has happened in your life, what happened in your ancestors' lives, what happened when you were a child, how were things with your parents, and really what's significant about your story. And then the last area that I would say that we differ, and this is probably going to be the most shocking one for most of you, is that we really focus on research. And rather than just letting what is known as the standard of care dictate like what we do on a day-to-day basis, the standard of care is when, a lot of doctors get together and they decide what the treatment for any particular condition should be. So people are going to say, well, wait, that's based on research. What do you mean? What I mean is that in day-to-day practice, we are in a much more nimble capacity to be able to look up research that pertains to the particular patterns that we see in any given patient. So I brought this study up because this is one of our favorites, where when we have patients who have been diagnosed with cancer and then they're suggested an immune checkpoint inhibitor, I don't think I've ever seen a conventional oncologist refer to this developed prognostic scoring system that was created by some folks down at MD Anderson in Texas that tells us if you've got elevated neutrophils, that's a type of white blood cell, if you have low lymphocytes, if you have an elevated lactate dehydrogenase, which is an enzyme that's associated with mitochondrial function, and anybody who took 8th grade or 9th grade biology knows that's the powerhouse of the cell, has everything to do with cancer. If you have an elevated LDH, which says your mitochondria aren't working, and you have kidney impairment, and we kind of throw in liver there too, because those are your two greatest organs that are going to have to metabolize and detoxify any patient from any drug therapy. And then if you have a low, what they call an ECOG score, which essentially has to do with, are you able to get up, walk around, make your own food, take care of yourself? So of those 7 things, if you've got more than 3 of them, a checkpoint inhibitor, we know is not going to fare well. So when you think about a lot of the cancer patients, you can imagine that a lot of these are issues for those people. And that's what we explicitly do, is we assess what's going on in the blood work, and then we make suggestions based on that. So that's just, one really clear-cut example of how we're using the latest and most up-to-date research coupled with our philosophy of medicine and a truly holistic approach. And then the last thing that I absolutely couldn't leave out here is trauma. And I think, as I've been hearing a lot and seeing a lot, there's a lot more focus around trauma. There's this term, trauma-informed care.
Mm-hmm.
Is there somebody saying something there?
No, I was just nodding my head and saying, yeah, I've heard of that.
Okay. So I think, trauma is really kind of one of the most fundamental things in all illness, because you have emotional trauma in terms of, verbal abuse or emotional abuse, or you can have physical trauma, but you can even, I would call the nutritional deficiencies and the lack of what we need, and, the standard American diet as it is now, even a trauma, because we're literally traumatizing our gastrointestinal tract, and then subsequently we're not getting what we need, and we're driving inflammation, and that inflammation then drives other biochemical processes that create free radicals, essentially electrons excessively that go around and cause a lot of damage in the body. So it really is like a what's the word I'm looking for? Molecular trauma. It's a molecular trauma that can happen, on a minuscule level, but it can be so systemic that it can really wreak a lot of havoc. And then metabolic trauma is really more around blood sugar and the damage that's being done to our pancreas, liver, our capacity to regulate blood sugars, and really that's impacting the endocrine system, which has everything to do with your feelings and your emotions. So all of this is all mixed up together, and what we're really doing is teasing it all out. And then I didn't say anything about ancestral trauma, but that's one of my key pieces that I'm often helping patients look at and look into, because we think, oh, well, is that genetic? Oh, that's not genetic. And I don't even think of it as genetic, because we've even found that most things are epigenetic, meaning above the gene, but that really everything is the term that I prefer, transgenerational. So it's not just about the DNA, but it's about what turn those genes on and off, and even how we can inherit like the temperament of a parent or a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle. And, families as a whole have like a personality, and all of that is part of what we pay attention to when we're using medicines such as homeopathy that helps balance and temper the different aspects of a person's personality and behavior, or when they're specifically stressed, and then likewise have an impact on the emotional status of the person. So anxiety and depression is a big part. So one of the biggest influences on my thinking early in my days was this book called The Divided Legacy. And it's actually, I've got a copy here. This is really, I mean, you can see what a juggernaut of a book this is. And this is the fourth volume, but the third volume, Harris Coulter wrote first. And he wrote this when he was in Europe traveling, and he was working on a PhD thesis about Russian history, and his wife became ill. And in his desperation to get her well, he ended up, going from doctor to doctor and couldn't find anybody to help her. And then he landed, hearing about this homeopathic doctor. So they go in, and the guy had books like stacked everywhere, and very dusty, crazy looking office. But he was the only man who was able to help his wife. So then he got profoundly interested in homeopathy and ended up diving into the history, and ended up writing this volume 3, what came to be volume 3 later, when he went back and went further in the history, further back, all the way back to the Paracelsus's time, and Hippocrates. The third volume is all about how the American Medical Association actually formed to oppose the economic, what shall we call them? The homeopaths were, taking away market share, and they didn't like that so much. And so the medical doctors, kind of came together and said, we're going to, go against these drugless doctors, as they were called back in the day before the term homeopathy was coined, and the homeopaths. So this third volume really covers the bulk of the 19th century, maybe 1830, 1840 onward. And then volume 4 is really more about the bacteriological era, and how immunology in the conventional and rational based medical system is really part of the vitalist approach that was started by the homeopaths, that was kind of taken on by the conventional system. And when you think about even what your immune system does, that's exactly what we work on as naturopathic doctors. We're really looking at, how do we modulate immune function? How do we normalize immune function, and recognize that it's really about the vitality of the individual? So I always have to give a little bit of a shout out to my mentors. So this is Dr. Gagnon. This is a little bit of an older picture, and you can see some of his cryptic French handwriting there at the bottom. But he passed away in 2009, but I had the good fortune of studying with him pretty intensively for 11 years, from the time that the year that I was graduating from naturopathic school in 1998 until 2009, because he came to Toronto a lot, and I had moved to Cleveland in 99. And so I just drove up there every time he was here. And I really just appreciate him so much, because he was my first mentor when it comes to what they call the terrain. And the terrain is really referring to the soil of the individual, meaning almost like your systemic health. And, I might as well just broach the topic now. Everyone's talking and wondering about COVID. So in our thinking, COVID, or SARS coronavirus 2, is not really any different than all the other coronaviruses that are out there. And people are saying, well, this person died and that person died. And, I would say, unless I actually see their blood work and see a full terrain workup, which for sure includes a lot more blood work than what is typically done, we can't know that there's something wrong with that person or not, to know that they would have had an acute illness that could put them in the hospital, or God forbid, take their life. So there's definitely, a lot of other factors going on here, but we focus on what we call the terrain. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes. So here's one of Dr. Gagno's quotes that I've always really appreciated. Rather than imposing anything, the service is the therapist's true mission. Rather than imposing anything, he is happy to propose. With his knowledge of natural laws, a knowledge based on observation and confirmed by intuition, he shows to their paths those who seek his assistance. As he helps his patients meet their physical, biological, and mental needs, they also become able to meet their abilities and their life project. This mission unfolds from love, a true and noble love whose aim is to be useful to the body, which must be respected, to the mind, which must be free, and to the spirit, which must be inspired. So Dr. Gagno absolutely lived this message. And ironically enough, it was cancer that actually took his life. And that's where Dr. Nasha Winters enters. So I found Nasha after kind of being, I won't say rudderless, but mentorless for probably a good five or 6 years, that I really had so much under my belt. I had a lot of experience under my belt, but no doctor knows anything. And I'm one of those doctors that I'm just like, I'm going to keep learning and learning and learning and learning and figuring it out. And if I don't know the answer, I will find the answer. So, we're constantly upping our game. And, now I have this whole team of people behind me trying to help me learn. But Nasha Winters, I have to tell you about Nasha Winters. So here's her book. Nasha had cancer 3 times by the time she was 19 years old. She'd had cervical cancer twice, 14 years old, 16 years old. And then when she was 19, she was so sick and nobody could figure out what was wrong with her. She would go into the emergency room probably every month, every other month. And finally, after, maybe 6-7 visits to the ER, there was a visiting doctor. And the visiting doctor said, you've been in and out of here a lot. Let's just do a CT scan. So they did a CT scan, and lo and behold, she was blown up with a massive tumor that looked like ovarian cancer. And when she went to the visit where the doctor was to talk to her about, what they thought was going on and what they were not going to do, actually, which was they were not going to treat her, because they were like, she was an end organ failure at the time. There's literally no treatment that they could do that they knew wasn't just going to put her in the ground sooner than if they just kind of let things be. So she thanked the doctor, who was weeping because he had a daughter her age, and he was, so impacted by this. She said, thank you. And she went straight to the library. She was already in pre-med, and she just started reading and researching. And early on in her time, she discovered the work of Thomas Seyfried. Actually, I believe she first discovered Otto Warburg, who was a researcher who won the Nobel Prize actually in like the 1930s. And he proposed that cancer was a metabolic disease. So what does that mean? It means that the DNA and the nucleus of the cell is reacting to the field around it, or what they call today the tumor microenvironment. So this is really the rabbit hole that she went down that really helped her save her own life. And it took her, decades. She's now 30 years out from her diagnosis, never did any conventional therapy whatsoever. And she is, certainly thriving, and she still has some tumors. They just sit there. They don't do anything. She monitors her blood work. And, she's had a few scares over the years when things would creep up, and then she goes and identifies, well, what is the problem? What's going on here? And I mean, she's had things happen from, emotional traumas that made her numbers rise, to once her thyroid numbers completely went kooky, because maybe some of you remember probably about 5 or 6 years ago, there was some massive, toxic chemical leak into the Colorado River, and she was living in Durango at the time, and suddenly all of her thyroid just went completely haywire, and she had Hashimoto's, and it just completely blew up her autoimmune process. So the cover of her book here has the terrain 10 there on the front of it, each one of those little symbols actually refers to the terrain 10 here that I have on the next slide. So these are the exact things that we focus on when we're working with cancer patients. So we're assessing the patient on all of these levels based on their blood work, based on their family history, based on their numbers, based on the tumors, genetics, and we're helping the person understand that cancer is not a single disease, but cancer is basically where everything has gone awry and pretty much everything has been repeatedly treated incorrectly. And it essentially is a big sign that says you need to change your whole life, because if you're not looking at these exact aspects and making a shift, then each of these that aren't being addressed will then come back and rear its head again at some point in the future, re-enter that concept of suppression. So, that's a big part of what I like to explain to folks, is that if you suppress something, meaning, you take even an antibiotic and you don't really understand why you had a particular infection manifest, then you're really just denying what that issue is, and you're delaying the problem for a later time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we can get into some of the cases. So I had already said a little bit more about research here, but here, this term here that I have, SYA University, this is actually a term that I got from one of Dr. Winter's patients, that she, back in October, I was at a mistletoe conference. Mistletoe is another medicine. We all know mistletoe, that, you hang up at Christmas time and you get kissed underneath it. But we use mistletoe, which is like a parasitic vine plant that grows on host trees. We use it in cancer, and it was first thought that it would be useful in cancer because of that doctrine of signatures, meaning that it's the way that it grows and the way that it behaves. It's almost like a tumor, where it grows out of season, it flowers out of season from when other plants are growing. It's growing inward, like on itself. It makes this little mass. So the SYA University came from a patient that came to the mistletoe conference who had been working with Dr. Winters. And she said, I went to SYA University, which she said is Save Your Ass University, because she essentially learned what she needed to do to save her own life from the ovarian cancer that she had had from working with Dr. Winters. And Dr. Winters ended up going on to become an expert in ovarian cancer, because someone found out about her on some online forum, and then they were just referring more and more people to her. So this was a woman who's basically still kind of like pulling away at the web of all of the different drivers that she's had to make sure that she stays stable and healthy for the long term. So what are the needs for being in this approach, looking at what you can do to help your own certainty that you're doing the right thing? So I say, generally each of us needs a team when we're that sick, because it's too much for any one person to take on. So, we're often making referrals to all kinds of other physicians who are supportive, like-minded, willing to work with us on our approach or make the prescriptions that we're asking for, requesting. The patient needs to have, guidance and understanding. They certainly need accurate information and metabolic flexibility. So this is maybe when I'm done here with the slides, I'll show you another poster presentation of Dr. Winters that explains a little bit more about metabolic flexibility, which is essentially the capacity to switch your fuel source. So are you going to burn sugar, or are you going to burn fat? And now those are really the only two options that we have. Is to take a glucose or to take a lipid and turn it into something that we can use as a higher organism to make energy, ATP, to drive all of the different actions throughout the body. And when we don't have metabolic flexibility, it basically means that we're stuck burning sugar. And this is really what's happened over the last 3-4 generations since we've introduced so many more carbohydrates into our diet, as well as giving people access to carbohydrates 24/7, 365. And the only way to really get that metabolic flexibility back is to restrict carbs and eat more fats. And that's, many people have probably heard about the ketogenic diet. We don't recommend the ketogenic diet across the board to everyone, but we help people understand and focus on where and when they need to be working on metabolic flexibility and how to do that. So as I had mentioned earlier, certainly working with trauma and assisting folks to release and resolve trauma, that's certainly fundamental to healing, and then real food. So Dr. Winters had stopped practicing a few years ago and started doing only doc consults. And she's now working with an organization out of DC that has a woman who basically was terminal with colorectal cancer. And she was told that, we don't have anything else to offer you. You're not responding to the chemotherapies that we've chosen to use with you. And she said, hey, I heard about this mistletoe. Would you support me? She asked her oncologist at Johns Hopkins if he would support her. And he was like, sure, whatever. And so now it's 12, 13 years later, and she's still alive. And she started this organization called Believe Big. And Believe Big helps people get educated and get access to mistletoe. They have a program for low-income folks where they give grants to help them get access to doctors like myself to get access to mistletoe. And now Dr. Winters and her and a few other key folks are looking to raise funds to build the hospital that we need here in the United States when we have very late stage, very complex cancer patients who cannot get the care that they need because it simply doesn't exist here in the United States. So a lot more I could say about that, but I've had a little bit of a vision for the Carmelite Monastery on the corner of Lee and Fairmount. And this has been purchased and it is undergoing a plan to be torn down, and they want to build housing here, but I had been working on it. It was part of the slideshow. And so I thought I will just leave that be here. My light is flashing. If you're seeing anything funny here, there's no UFO in the room. But I just had to throw this out there because if you've ever been in this monastery, it's basically like a ready-made hospital. And I would love to see something happen there. So here's a little screenshot of my website. It's optionsnaturopathic.com. I believe that's on the next slide. If you want to know more, you can hop on there and do a little bit of a deep dive in all that we do. And lots of really just tons and tons of content on there. And we did a redesign of the website last summer, so it's a little bit easier to navigate. And we do have an online store, and we'll be, as time goes forward and time allows, we'll be doing more posting of different protocols and different supports, but there are some acute supports on there, and I'm working on making those things more readily available. So that was, really all that I had in terms of a prepared presentation, but I would love to, have an ongoing conversation here and take people's questions.
If anyone has any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Thank you. That was fascinating.
I can certainly also talk about different cases and different types of illnesses other than cancer, because I mean, let me tell you, I would much prefer to have non-cancer patients rather than cancer patients as my patients. I would much rather get to people before they are so late stage and really in, you know, big trouble. It makes everybody's lives much easier, and we really like to head that one off at the pass before it becomes a really life endangering problem. I mean, it's just so overwhelming to get that diagnosis. And unfortunately, I really have to say that the longer I have studied with Dr. Winters, I really think that, you know, this is going to overtake all of the other big killers. And, you know, it's like, what is it? One in 3 women, 1 in 2 men that are expected to get cancer in their lifetime. I mean, the statistics are just really terrifying.
Yes.
And we really, there are ways to know, you know, if we're at risk. And even if that's not your primary thing, it would be really wonderful to help people who have, you know, anxiety, depression. I mean, there's just so many things that can be done so that we're not having to suffer and live a miserable life and be a more productive member of society, as well as a more functional member of our household, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have a question.
Yes.
My daughter has scalp psoriasis, and everything I've read, it's like an autoimmune, like from a leaky gut.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to incorporate more greens, no sugar, but what else can we do?
Well, I would say that, you know, the way that my clinical mind works, I'm wanting to know all about her history and the family history, and, you know, how many courses of antibiotics and who else in the family had autoimmune conditions. There's really a tremendous number of things that can be done. I mean, psoriasis is a bit of a beast because of that autoimmunity. So we would look at and assess what different autoantibodies are there, and we would implement a very specific gut healing protocol. It's not always easy for me to just say, oh, try this and that, because that particular condition is a tougher one. So I would be leading you astray. I mean, and at the same time, like I'm absolutely not fishing for patients, because I have more than enough patients. We do have Dr. Laura who can help folks, and there's a little bit of a wait to work with me. I'm just trying to think. I mean, there's certainly the piece around the leaky gut is helpful. We have a couple of bundles that we're trying to put together specifically for gut healing. I don't believe that they're completed as of yet, but you would be welcome to send me a message or my team a message through our website. There's a way to contact us and just say you spoke with me during my talk tonight. And we could make some suggestions there around like exactly what. I mean, it's a hard one.
Okay, I might just make an appointment with Dr. Laura, because my other daughter sees her and loves her.
Great. Awesome. Anybody else have any questions or anything that I talked about?
What is your opinion of the COVID vaccination?
Well, we all knew that question was going to come up, didn't we? Well, I will have to say that for me, I have never been an advocate of any kind of vaccination. And I'm one of the few doctors that's willing to just put that out there, because I am absolutely a vitalist who understands that the concept of immunization was one that originated in homeopathy, was never intended to use a gross substance, meaning a molecular substance, to stimulate the immune system. It was part of that volume 4, very well explained in this history of medicine that I mentioned. And in fact, there's some really great quotes in here that help us to understand that this is another thing that most people don't even know, is that the concept, the phenomenon of allergy and autoimmunity didn't exist prior to the onset of vaccinations being implemented. Allergies and autoimmunity didn't even, there weren't even words for it, because it was, if it happened, it was so rare, it was not part of the medical dialogue. So think about that.
Yeah.
What have we done to our immune systems with antibiotics, multiple vaccinations before a child is 5 years old, 10 years old?
Yeah.
So as this book very clearly, this true history of medicine that looks at both sides and not just the official mainstream side, it talks about how there is the ineluctable fact that to stimulate one's immune system through a artificial means is very much a fine line between overstimulating that immune system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you,
I have heard that that is one of the causes of autoimmunity diseases.
So I wouldn't say at this point that it's the sole cause of autoimmunity. I would say there's a lot of other factors that have to do with autoimmunity, but I think it's really fascinating how much more prevalent it became, so much that they, came up with the labels for it. Toxicants and gut dysfunction and all of the damage that our diets have done to our gastrointestinal tracts is certainly another component there. So, that's making a very broad swath and a broad claim that, some people will be like, what? But if you heard my whole talk tonight, you'll understand that I'm coming from a completely 180-degree reorientation about how you view your health. And then another thought dawned on me last week, which is that I've been at this for so long, and I've seen so many resolutions of cases, both chronic and acute, that I have a capacity to have 100% faith in this method of approaching illness. And I know that homeopathy works. And as I often will say to people that, if you have an acute illness, say you have a baby who's, an infant, and they're crying in the night and they're screaming and wailing and you can't get them down, and they have a fever and you're terrified they're going to have a seizure, and you get with your naturopathic doctor or your homeopathic doctor and they say, give that baby one little dose of belladonna, and you do that, and then the baby's asleep in 5 minutes. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened, or, an ear infection, and the child is screaming and just miserable because they're in pain. And, most parents are being told to give your child Tylenol. Well, Tylenol is a hepatotoxin. It's toxic to the liver. So, parents that are doing that out of anxiety because they don't want their child to be in pain, they're actually creating a bigger problem. And I've actually had multiple cases where that was a big part of the work that we had to undo. And I've even had cases where the child developed hepatitis that then had to be treated because they went into acute liver failure, or the body was, blowing up the liver and trying to resurrect their liver function. And then I had another case, this was, years ago when I was still working with Dr. Gagnon before I knew Dr. Winters, of a young boy who developed a cancerous condition called aplastic anemia, where basically his entire bone marrow shut down. And this was after his mother had been giving him Tylenol so often with every illness that he had. He then went into acute hepatitis, which then they gave him ursodiol. It's basically a bile medicine suppressant, and it caused him to then shut down his bone marrow. And he was then they were giving him transfusions, platelet transfusions, blood transfusions, which Dr. Gagnon, coached me back in the day. This was like almost 15 years ago. And, you know, that young man was able to avoid a bone marrow transplant and, you know, potential lifelong sterility issues. And he's a functioning, healthy young man today. But just, you know, just one story that, you know, had a profound impact on me because the parents trusted me and were able to do things differently than what that conventional approach would have been.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. You mentioned a couple books. What were the titles of those?
So I mentioned Divided Legacy, which is a 4-part history of medicine that goes all the way back to Paracelsus with volume 1, and then the 20th century with volume 4. And then I also mentioned Dr. Nasha Winter's metabolic approach.
Nasha. How do you spell Nasha?
So it's Nasha. And in fact, on that particular slide that I had of hers, I suggest to people to, if you've got a smartphone, pull up your browser on your smartphone and go to Dr. Nasha, DrNasha.com. And then scroll to the bottom and there'll be a little pop-up that you can just X out of, or on your computer, you can do that. It's basically a little guide to what 5 steps to take if you get a cancer diagnosis. It's a great little guide. But for the purposes I'm talking about here, go to drnasha.com and scroll to the bottom and go to her media page or go to the podcast page. And if you're driving in the car, just listen to the umpteen time she's been interviewed. And if you're at home cooking, pull up one of her videos, because you will absolutely get a continuation of this education and more in learning about these concepts that are really about stopping cancer before it's diagnosed and what to do when it is diagnosed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you said Dr. Nasha. Now you don't. That's not Winters. I thought that was the lady that had Winters for a last name.
That is, but her website is Dr. Nasha.
Oh, okay.
You got it right.
That's good. And then this Believe Big.
Yes.
What was that again?
So Believe Big is an organization that is set up to help people obtain information, education, and access to mistletoe therapy for cancer.
Okay.
But they are now also creating there's another organization that's called BBIH, which is
say that again.
BBIH.
BB as in boy?
As in Believe Big.
Oh, okay. BB.
The Believe Big Institute of Health.
Oh, IH. Okay. And that's the place you were talking about with the monastery, right?
No, well, sorry if I moved too quickly and confused you. So the monastery is here in Cleveland, and I would love for us to grow to the point of, you know, being able to have a healing center in there. And Options Naturopathic Clinic, my clinic, is now considered a center of excellence for the Believe Big Institute of Health. The Believe Big Institute of Health is the vision that Dr. Nasha Winters has with Evie Lee's Page, the woman who started the Believe Big organization. So here's the website for Believe Big. And this is actually, if you see here up at the top, it says BBIH. This is their vision for having a hospital.
I see.
And, you know, I point them out because I just think that people don't often know what is available to them when they get diagnosed with a cancer. So there's, you know, that's partly what inspired.
Oh, there's her name. Yeah.
There's her name.
Okay.
So Evie Lee's here on the left is the woman who had colorectal cancer. Dr. Winters had ovarian cancer. Jimmy is Evie Lee's husband. And then Steve Ottersberg here is Nasha's husband. and Debbie Glee is the admin person. So they have a whole program where they're training. Dr. Winters has created a whole program where she's training other physicians, and now they're on to their third cohort of physicians that have gone through the training program with her. And when you've graduated from that, you're eligible to become a center of excellence with BBIH. And so that just happened with options as of January. So we had that as an announcement in our newsletter, but
Congratulations.
thank you. It's, yeah, she's kind of a big deal. I may end up doing doc consults myself, but I'm not sure how we can make that work with my limited time.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Did I answer the question about the vaccines enough, or is there?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with you.
And
Yeah.
anyone else have any other?
I don't
comments?
know. I hope they're not going to make it mandatory.
Well, I tell a lot of my patients to not worry about that. I mean, I think there's far too many people in the population that would not. I mean, I think there's just too much at risk for, various businesses, and where there's a will, there's a way, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't fret about it. I mean, I know a lot of people are very anxious about it, but I think really what we need to do is we just need to be focusing on taking care of ourselves and routing out the root causes of these things and identifying when our immune systems aren't working, and really training more and more doctors how to appropriately read just a basic complete blood count.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can see when the immune system is not functional. So you recall when I was talking about that prognostic scoring system when it comes to immune checkpoint inhibitors, immunotherapy for cancer, that if you have elevated neutrophils or low lymphocytes, that's 2 counts on that prognostic scoring system. And many, many, many times I'm looking at a elderly person's complete blood count, and they have very high neutrophils and very low lymphocytes. What you want on your complete blood count is 2-to-1 ratio. That's the sign of a functioning immune system. And many people don't have one. I don't have one, and I'm working on it myself, So people want to just toss their hands up and say, I don't know. Well, when you come across a doctor who had to literally figure it out or die, she figured it out, and
Yeah.
this is really pulling through, reading research, and the beauty of what Dr. Nasha has done is she's taken all of the different holistic schools of thought in medicine. So homeopathy, Ayurvedic medicine, which is the ancient method of holistic medicine that came out of India, then Chinese medicine. So we have Chinese herbal medicine, we have 5-element theory, where we understand that the different organs in the body relate to the 5 elements: earth, air, fire, water, ether. And then how do those things present, manifest? How do they interact with each other? And then taking those concepts and homeopathy and applying it to what she learned from the conventional medical side and the training that we have as naturopathic physicians, because modern day naturopathic physicians are essentially taking conventional medical training, research, and coupling it with holistic, nature-based therapeutic methods and making sense out of all of it. So what Nasha really did with that Terrain 10 that I pointed out is she really gave us guideposts on how to think about things.
Could you say again what that 2-1 ratio was between was it neutrophils?
neutrophils and lymphocytes.
Lymph,
these are-
lymphocytes.
Yeah, so these are going to be your most common types.
And which one is the two? The neutrophil?
The neutrophils should be, so it should be somewhere around like 60% neutrophils and 30% lymphocytes, or
I see.
55% neutrophils and like 28%, or so really if you just took the neutrophil number, the percentage, because they also give it in absolutes, the absolute number, but if you look at the percentage of the total of all 5 types of white blood cells, it's going to add up to 100%. But if you just take the neutrophils and the lymphocytes and you divide the neutrophil percentage by the lymphocyte percentage, you should have a number that's between 1 and 2.
I see.
That's a way to know whether your immune system's functioning. And if it's not, it really takes some work to figure out what's sitting on top of your immune system, what has prevented your immune system from appropriately functioning.
And all CBCs have those two things in it.
Well, actually, it has to be a CBC with what's called a differential, which means they do the measure of the different white blood cell types. Otherwise, they just give you a total of the white blood cells. And that is, unfortunately, the one that most medical doctors order, because they're not necessarily, unless they're looking at a condition where they expect there to be, a lot of like, I don't know why they don't order it. They just don't. I wish they would more often.
Probably protocol. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe they just think it's not necessary, but for us, it's critical. We would never order it without that.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. Thank you so much for your knowledgeable report.
Yes. So, anything else anybody's wondering about or want me to speak more to? I wanted to specifically leave it more open-ended so we could have a little bit more of a discussion here.
I don't know, you've given us an awful lot to think about, for sure.
Can I just share something, please?
Please,
So,
I'd love that.
So Dr. Erin has been our doctor, my family doctor, for 16 years. So she is here because when I was talking to Jane, we were looking for a speaker, and I said, I think what Erin has to share is very important and more people need to know about this. So Erin has treated my entire family for 16 years. And I know there's a few people on the Zoom call that are seeing her and have seen her for years as well. And this is basically all we do in my family is natural medicine. And my 4th child, who's 17, was about 1.5 years of age or so, 1 year, something like that, when we first went to see Erin. And I learned so much at that time, in him being so young. I was able to implement a lot of this with him growing up. So just so you know how it has impacted us, and so Joey has not been fully vaccinated because I learned too much about vaccines very early on. So there are many vaccines that he hasn't gotten and hasn't received, and with the ones that he has received and the ones that my other children have received, I was able to give them remedies that Dr. Holston was talking about, the pounding and all that. They're little pellets that you get in little bottles that you can take, and it helped to eliminate any residue or I don't know their exact terminology, from their bodies that were left behind from their vaccines. So Joey is now 17, has never ever been on antibiotics or any prescription drug of any kind, and on a rare occasion will sneak ibuprofen when I'm not looking, but has really been my most healthy child of all 4 of them, just because I was able to implement this at a very early age. but all of my kids, including my husband and myself, have been treated by her. And in times where early on we were seeing other doctors and they were trying to prescribe Zoloft and all these other types of medications, is when I found her through my constant research. I came across her, and I know it was divine intervention, but in a matter of 5 days, she was able to transform my child, who I took to see Erin, in a matter of 5 days, where MD wanted to prescribe some sort of antidepressant or whatever. And in 5 days, her recovery was so significant because I had not medicated her in any way. So it was easier to treat her because there was nothing in it affecting her as far as that way. And what we did find with a lot of my family was family history and trauma in different ways through my husband and myself. Nothing horrible, but just different things in our life that were then passed on to our children in birth, which you don't think about, but it happens. And so we kind of had to go back and rewrite, I guess, our history in a way so that that didn't continue in the future. So just in simple terms, because I'm not like Dr. Holston, I don't know the terminology, but it does work, and it works very quickly if you're not so far along in the process. Like Dr. Erin said, if you can prevent cancer from happening by looking at things, by doing blood work, by diet and different things like that, then if something were to happen in the future, you're in a better place to be able to take care of it faster. Right, Erin? I guess.
Yeah. That
Yeah, I
that
mean,
makes sense.
it's a good way to put it, in that, the sooner that we can help someone really correct that root cause that's at the very basis and the very beginning, the easier it is to help them go forward. And the longer that someone has been using pharmaceuticals, I mean, this is what I was so grateful for to find Nasha, because I always knew that. I always believed that wholeheartedly. And unfortunately, a lot of students go through naturopathic school and they don't even have the alignment with that core philosophy. But when I found Nasha, I was like, oh my God, like she's figured out everything that I haven't figured out. But I always knew that it was, you have to understand that when you're taking a chemical, a man-made chemical, which is a pharmaceutical, is a man-made chemical, the more you take it, and then certain pharmaceuticals are of course more destructive than others. They're not all bad. They're not all as bad as other ones are bad, but the more you rely on pharmaceuticals and the more that's a pattern, the more you are driving further dysfunction in your molecular biology, or what we call your biochemistry. There's
Right.
just no denying that. I mean,
Yeah.
these are chemicals that have to be eliminated from the body through using different enzymatic pathways, the different cytochrome pathways. They're either metabolized by the liver or the kidney. And when you're on a lot of this and a lot of that, one or the other is going to get impacted. And then you add to that the burden of, poorly managed hypertension, and the fact that nobody's looking at why do you have hypertension, which is usually a metabolic issue, which is, early cardiovascular disease is usually a metabolic problem, meaning blood sugar. When you hear the word metabolic, think blood sugar. And when you get to the root of those issues, then you essentially are going to push back on the degeneration that's taking place. So that's, really what we do it really just means that we're helping people make their pharmaceuticals obsolete, because when you actually correct the root cause of the problem, then the pharmaceutical becomes unnecessary. And in a lot of cases, it's preferred, because when you actually correct it, you're going to feel a lot better, and you're not going to have the side effects that you would have, say, even if like you're going on a thyroid medicine. Thyroid medicine is absolutely related to hyperlipidemia, high cholesterol, and if it's driven from the autoimmune type of hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, then that's also related to various cancer types. Because if you don't address the autoimmunity, eventually that overactive immune system just also punks out and you have immunodeficiency. So it's very well established that chronic autoimmune conditions are part and parcel of what contribute to cancering processes, as we think of them and call them in this holistic purview.
Wow.
So yes, a lot to think about, a lot that, isn't readily told to you. And, a lot that I've been willing to say and to educate people around, that a lot of people aren't really typically looking at or talking about. And, one of the other biggest, this is actually one of Sue's favorite things, is something called the brain protocol. So this was one of the geniuses of Dr. Gagnon, whereby he was really the primary person developing this conceptual protocol that's called the brain protocol. And I really think it would have been better to call it the maturation protocol or the optimal development protocol, because essentially what it's doing is it's helping a person who had any kind of interruption to their developmental process. And that interruption could have been something that they even inherited from a parent who had an interruption to their developmental process. So what do I mean by that? An interruption to your development. So, if you think birth to age 7 and age 7 to puberty, and puberty until, you're in your late 20s, when we would consider someone a fully fledged independent adult. It takes 28 years to actually develop a human to their complete adultness, unbeknownst to most, but that's how we think about it. So Dr. Gagnon created this protocol that really was syncing together what's linked in the development based on time. So in the first year, you have the adrenal glands, the brain stem, and the digestive tract as one kind of primary focus of what is really finishing the neurological connections between those organs and optimal functioning. And if you have a child who, had, say, abuse happen at that time in their life, or maybe they even had a single incident that happened in their life, something could have gotten interrupted in their development. And then likewise, you can have a child who had an interruption from their first year and a half that corresponds to the thyroid gland up to the age 7. So thyroid and the limbic system, which is the emotional brain, and the liver is what really is in that span of time that's completing its development. So, he really looked at what was happening physiologically at the time. Like the liver is really learning how to make its own immunoglobulins, and the child's immune system is going to school at that time, and, learning from the thymus gland how to recognize, what it needs to recognize to be able to have specific immunity. And the limbic system is all about being able to memorize and being able to remember and have an emotional affinity with something. That's really what allows our memory to work, is these feeling states that little infants, don't have. You tell an infant, no, and they're like, what? And they keep doing it, right? Until they're getting closer to a year old. And when that limbic system kicks in, then they have that capacity for memory. So, then it goes into the brain, the higher brain, the cortex, and the pituitary gland, and the kidneys, or maybe the lungs. That's like the third phase of the brain protocol. And that really has to do with age 7 up until age puberty, which, of course, varies from person to person. But this conceptual protocol that he created has really helped hundreds of our patients when they're coming up against a situation where they may be struggling with a particular situation in their life. They may be struggling with the transition. They may be unable to get past some aspect of their own inner development, meaning their sense of self, which I think of as tantamount to their immune function too, because it's really, your immunity is nothing but what is that part of me that is to identify what is me and what is not me, or what is human versus what is not human. So when we have a quote unquote infection, when we blow up with some, runny nose and fever and this and that and the other, it's like the body has identified something that needs to be purged. And I don't mean that it's identified a microbe. I mean that usually these types of illnesses come when there's been a resolution of some trauma or some blockage. And it's actually the microbes doing us a favor that they go in and scope and find, and they say, oh, the microbe's the cause. They give you an antibiotic, they shut the whole thing down and suppress that toxic elimination discharge that the body was attempting. I mean, our bodies are really functional, and there's a reason that we have acute illnesses. So, we look to the root to get to it. And, I have a little bit of a different approach than probably most naturopathic doctors out there. I really don't ascribe to this concept of infection, meaning that you catch something and then you got rid of it. It's more that when you are shifting your being in some way, you are maybe had a new learning or a new resolution, or maybe you just had a very stressful semester and you finish final exams and the next day you get sick. It's like your body then goes, I'm going to breathe a sigh of relief now, and I'm going to stop holding all of this stress in, managing through inflammation. And then the body goes through a period of self-correction. So we really watch these patterns and we respect them without thinking that it's just okay to give an antibiotic at any, given time. And, we all know antibiotics are being abused at this point. They're in our water, they're in our food, they're given to cattle, repeatedly to fatten them up and get them ready to slaughter. But this has an impact on all of us. Any food that you eat that is, non-organic, any animal products that have, hormones and antibiotics in them, these absolutely will have an impact on your health. And it's something that nobody who lives on this good green earth can escape at this point. So I implore everyone to, raise your level of awareness around what you're getting exposed to. Think about it. Don't be like an ostrich and stick your head in the sand, because it's going to come back and impact all of us at some point. I can guarantee it. And, again, Dr. Nasha will give you a lot more education on this. And
Could you spell that doctor's name on the brain protocol?
His name is Gainio. It's Gueniot.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
It's French. So yeah, he's a little harder to come by, but I have found some interesting French websites. I don't remember if they're in English or not, but there is a little bit about him on my website, given he was my first terrain oriented mentor.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
And there's also two articles on my website about the brain protocol. There's like a short little blip, and then there's a deeper dive. So you can go onto our website, Options Naturopathic, and just search the word brain, and you can read about that for a little bit clearer explanation.
How many doctors are with you in your practice?
Well, I have just one right now, but I'm looking for another one because we need more help.
Well, Dr. Erin, we could probably go on. We could have you go on for quite a while, but we're closing in on 8 o'clock, so we should probably thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was
It
interesting.
was fascinating and
Yeah,
given me a lot to think about for sure.
yeah, definitely.
And thank you, Sue, for bringing Dr. Erin to us.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks to everyone for joining in, and it was great to have you all here.
Okay,
And
thank you.
you
I
very
wish
much.
I could see all your lovely faces, but I understand